It's Monday here on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined today by Ray Fittipaldo. We're going to talk about what the Steelers need to do to rebound from their 3-game losing streak with 1 game left before they actually head into the playoffs. They have a lot to correct. Can they do it? Well, we'll look at history and how it relates to what they're trying to do right now. We'll also talk about this offensive line that has struggled here and there, but also has a lot of young pieces that have shown good things as well during that stretch. We can also talk about George Pickens and what he has to do to grow up and prove he's the Steelers' future wide receiver one. All here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined today by Ray Fittipaldo, one of our great Steelers beat writers. And as always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this if you enjoy it, subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injury victims for over 40 years recover more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one have been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, this Steelers team is reeling. They've lost 3 straight. We've covered that up and down after the Chiefs game. Now we have to look forward. They're now behind in the division race. But the main focus right now is if they beat the Bengals, and the Ravens lose, they win the division. But Ravens probably aren't losing to the Browns. But if they beat the Bengals, they guarantee themselves the 5 seed in the playoffs, which means they get to go on the road to play Houston, who easily is playing the worst of all division leaders in the AFC right now. That means you don't get the Chiefs, which you wouldn't get because they're the 1 seed. You don't get the Bills, though they're guaranteed to not play the Bills already. They're locked out of the 7 seed, so it's either the 5 or the 6. But you also don't go to play the Baltimore Ravens in Baltimore, where you just got beat a couple weeks ago. And I think it's imperative for, if the Steelers are going to get right, you can do so against a hot Cincinnati team that's won 4 games in a row, that's looking really sharp, that believes in itself and thinks it can get to the playoffs. It still will need help even if they beat the Steelers in this game. But I think this is a unique opportunity, but maybe it's not that unique, because last year the Steelers were on a 3-game losing streak. They were coming back to Pittsburgh, and they were playing a streaking Bengals team. Granted, that team had Jake Browning. This has Joe Burrow. And the Steelers weren't in the playoffs then. They are now. But I do think the Steelers, if they can embrace some of the things that got them back into their groove last year, this year, I do think a turnaround of them playing good football could happen in this game, and maybe even for a playoff game or 2.
Yeah, Chris, I totally agree with you. I think this is a really important game. And I think, yes, the winning and losing matters in this game, because, as you notice, the difference between going and playing a struggling Houston team on the road or a Ravens team that really just handled you a few days ago with relative ease. But I think just getting back to doing what you do, like what Deshaun Elliott was saying after the game, we have to get back to being who we are. That's the most important thing. Get rid of the blown coverages. Communicate well, shut down the run, do everything that you were doing as a defense early in the season. And, we'll see where that leads in the playoffs. And then if you're talking about getting the offense back on track, cut down on the bad turnovers, like we've seen, ill-timed turnovers that really cost you, and get back to what you do best. And that's being a complementary football team that takes advantage of the turnovers that the defense gives you. So that's been their formula since the beginning of the season. They haven't been able to recapture that here for most of December. And I think you're right. I think they need to rediscover that formula going into the postseason.
I mean, you look at the stretch that they were on, where, like, sure, they had a turnover here and there in some other games, but by and large, they limited their turnovers and they created turnovers. They were, there was a stretch there where they were averaging 2 or 3 turnovers a game in a lot of their wins, and they were able to make things happen. And some people call it turnover luck, but what the Steelers prefer to call it, that's what we aim to do with our defense. Yeah. We set up those opportunities for our defense to take advantage of those moments. And they had one turnover against the Ravens, no turnovers against the Chiefs, and that played a big factor in those games. Meanwhile, also, they haven't taken care of the football like they normally have. 2 turnovers in both of those games. That was the first, when they did it against the Ravens, it was the first time since their win over the Commanders that they had 2 turnovers a game, and the only other time this year before that was the Colts game. So this has been uncharacteristic stuff that they've done in these losses, things that they hadn't done all season. When you look at what they had been doing, they had been one of the best defenses in the NFL. They're still in the top 10, but now they're outside of the top 5. They had been one of the best offenses in the NFL. They were in the top 10. Now they're more closer to the middle of the pack. And so I think it's things that are within their control that they can do a lot better. There's things that, certainly the Chiefs and the Ravens and the Eagles all deserve credit for how they outplayed the Steelers in those games. But there's also things the Steelers could have handled on their own that would have either put them in contention in those games later, or maybe even won the game. And I think that's where it comes down to being within their control. I saw after the game, former Steeler Chris Hope was talking about how the Steelers have played late, and he compared them to the 2005 Steelers. And he said, look, we were a flawed team in 2005 when they won the Super Bowl and Super Bowl 4. They pointed like, hey, we were flawed. We had our mistakes, but we got hot at the end, and we figured a way to think things out. If you remember, Ray, that 2005 team, there were people looking at that season saying, oh, they lost to Peyton Manning and the Colts. They're a juggernaut. They don't stand a chance against them in the playoffs. They're a pretender. They're not a contender. And then they were able to get hot at the end of the season. They beat the Bengals in Cincinnati in the playoffs, and then they went into Indianapolis and stole that one from the Colts. There was a really good team, but the Steelers just had their number that day. I do think there's room for this Steelers team to get hot in the playoffs, but it has to start with them playing their kind of football and playing well against the Bengals.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know, the AFC North is going to come down to Saturday, but listen, The Ravens are 18.5-point favorites over the Browns.
Jeez.
A Browns team that looks like it's packed it in. So the Steelers are likely going to be on the road throughout this postseason journey if they do get hot. So what better way, even though this game is at home against the Bengals, what better way to get back to playing football in the postseason, the travels, right? So play that good brand of defensive football that you want to be known for. That was your calling card early in the season. And then I know it's kind of been – I know the running numbers, Chris, have been there in recent weeks. Thought they were padded in this last game against the Chiefs, like some late runs that – really wasn't something they leaned on early. It just kind of the numbers got, total up by game's end. But if you can get back to running the football and then getting it to George Pickens early, feed him so he gets a little bit of confidence early in these games, I really think, that could be a formula that the Steelers could follow here in the postseason. You go back to 2005, they were a 7-5 football team. I think they had just lost to the Bengals at home, kind of struggling. And then they put together this 4-game winning streak, and then boom, you're the last seed in the AFC. You get into the playoffs, but you get on a roll. Now this is happening later. They're struggling later in December than they were in 2005. But if they can get some momentum going off this game against Cincinnati, and listen, Cincinnati's going to have everything to play for because they're not going to know their fate until Sunday. So this is a playoff game for Cincinnati. We know how hot Joe Burrow is, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. This is going to be a real test for the Steelers. So if the Steelers can build some confidence, go in and play a good football team against the team that's either going to be in the playoffs or on the fringe of the playoffs, I think that's a good sign. So this is a very important week for the Steelers and how they go about their business.
Mike Tomlin talked about earlier in the season when they played a streaking Washington Commanders team. They said they're hot, they're on fire, but we like to be the firemen and put teams like that out. This is their opportunity to do that again, but they have to do it. If they don't, they could still go to Houston if they lose this game, but they put themselves in a position where most likely they're headed to Baltimore and they're playing another red hot team in Baltimore, and they're still going to be searching for answers. Better to get those answers now moving forward. I want to talk about the offensive line because you talked about the run game there, and I want to talk about what they have done, what they haven't done, and whether or not this mostly young group can solidify itself and find some strength, much like it did last year in the last 3 games after they went into a 3-game skid late last season. We'll talk about that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you the show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're injured in an accident, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, for 40 years, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injured victims answer that question. Whether it's gathering evidence, collecting medical records, or dealing with the insurance companies, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped over 75,000 people handle the what's next question. Call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about this offensive line for a bit here because I went back. I left that game on Acrisure Stadium on Christmas Day and thought, man, the offensive line got manhandled with how much pressure Russell Wilson was facing, and he was facing left and right. But then when I look back on the film, the pressure sure came from Dan Moore. He had a really bad game, gave up 2 sacks, but like 5 pressures. As I say, Seumalo wasn't that good. But the right side of the line, the young guys, they actually didn't give up much pressure. In fact, they were assets in the run game. And even early in the game, like as you point out, like Najee Harris got a lot of garbage time yards. Like he had like 20 yards going into the 4th quarter. And then when the game was over, the Steelers just kind of ran out the clock, and the Chiefs kind of were just like, okay, we're not going to go too hard right here. And so he got his. But Jaylen Warren, while the game was on the line, was averaging 6.5 yards per carry when the Chiefs were trying to stop the Steelers there. And I do think in some of those plays, it was some good blocking from the Steelers offensive line that set that up. I also thought there were some plays against the Ravens where Jaylen Warren ran really well behind some good blocking from the Steelers offensive line. Ray, this has been, and just like this has been a flawed team, this has been a flawed offensive line, but flawed does not mean broken. Flawed does not mean impossible to win with. It just means you got weaknesses. Is this an offensive line that you think can play more to its style that it's been hoping to get to throughout this season and has shown at times?
Yeah, listen, Andy Weidl and Omar Khan want to build a dominating physical offensive line. They've used high draft picks to get some of these guys. A lot of these guys are playing right now. Of course, Troy Fautanu is not. We know he'll be back next season. I think they can be that type of line in the future, but I don't think they are that type of line right now. Now, that doesn't mean that the Steelers offense cannot have success in the playoffs. I think they can, but I think it all comes down to the rhythm of the play calling, how Arthur Smith calls a game. I think he has to be a little bit more non-rhythmic in his play calling. Don't just give the ball to Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren on first down. Maybe mix it up a little bit. Get a little bit more creative. Go play action on first down. Throw on first downs for your running backs, and then you get the defense on their heels a little bit. I thought Arthur Smith's best game of the season. I think the Steelers' offense's best game of the season was that first game in Cincinnati. They came out, they took advantage of what the Bengals were giving them. Okay, you're not going to cover Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. Fine, we're going to take that 10 or 15 yards every time. We're going to march down the field, and that opened things up for George Pickens in that passing game. People forget Calvin Austin was knocked out of that game fairly early. Yeah. They were still able to roll up 44 on the Bengals. So I think, the Steelers offensive line can, be successful in the playoffs, but I think they need some help from Arthur Smith. And I think he has to put them in the right situations. At this stage, Chris, I don't think they're ready, to be like an Eagles offensive line, right? They're not like the Eagles or some of these other teams that go in and know they could beat you up and have a 2,000-yard rusher. That's not what the Steelers are right now.
No.
But if Arthur Smith helps them out a little bit, dials up the right plays, breaks some tendencies, I think they can get there.
What's crazy is I think he's done that a little bit better the last 2 weeks. I said 3 weeks ago, no, that was a big problem. But also that was why I said back before the Eagles game, I was like, they're probably losing this game because the Steelers they're building to be the Andy Weidel type of team that he built in Philadelphia. The Eagles are that team right now. Like that's why Saquon Barkley, is on fire. Their offensive line's put together. Their experience, they know how to play together. This offensive line's trying to get to that point. And it can be moments like this, time periods like this in a season that can help you figure those things out and trust each other as a group. You covered Marquise Pouncey, David DeCastro, Marcus Gilbert, Ramon Foster, Alejandro Villanueva, like that whole crew. It took time for them to build that chemistry that the Steelers fans came to know and love throughout the 2010s. It's moments like this that this group can build chemistry of their own. Mason McCormick, Broderick Jones, Zach Frazier. If Isaac Seumalo is going to be around next year, there's chances for them to do that right now. And I think that that's something that is within their peer review. And also, again, they get a Bengals team that hasn't been playing well up front. Like, you look at what the Bengals have been doing. You look at that Broncos game that they found a way to win in overtime. They weren't stopping the Broncos on the ground. The Broncos were running when they wanted to. In fact, they've given up over 100 yards rushing in 5 of their last 6 games. The only thing is Joe Burrow's made up for that. Now the Steelers, they're used to Joe Burrow. They not that they've dominated him or anything, but they can plan around him, just like they can plan around this offense getting back on track, just like it got back on track last year when they played the Bengals then, with Mason Rudolph. So I think there's a chance for this offense, and especially this offensive line, to figure itself out this week, find its confidence again, hit on some plays. And when you can just hit on some plays, the confidence that comes from that, the consistency that can build from that can carry you, that can give you momentum, and this can be a momentum team. It's not, like you said, this isn't a team where you can win the cloud of dust battles all game long. But if Arthur Smith can get teams in the right positions and say, hey, all right, not a loaded box, we can win this matchup. This is when we're running the ball, and that gets the Steelers offense going. That can be the key. But they are, like you said, they are not the team that can just roll out and say, we're running it. It doesn't matter what you do. This is going to be a 5-yard gain. I agree with you. Arthur Smith plays a big role in whether or not this offensive line, this run game, this offense can find its rhythm, at this stage of the season.
Yeah, listen, it takes all 5. Listen, it's like the defense. If there's one breakdown, everyone looks bad. So, listen, if Dan Moore doesn't execute his block and everything else is blocked up perfectly, it doesn't matter, right? But I do think if you're looking for a positive in all of this, it's what you said. It's the young guys for the most part. And, all these young guys are going to have their ups and downs. But for the most part, Broderick Jones, Mason McCormick, Zach Frazier have been solid all season, right? They're not playing at a Pro Bowl level, but they're solid. And I think if you get that young enthusiasm and they know they have confidence, they know they're playing well, that can be a great asset for you going into the postseason because they don't know any better. They don't carry any of that baggage that the Steelers have from 2020 or 2021 or even 2023 last year when they made the playoffs. This is the 4th time in the past 5 years that the Steelers are in the playoffs, Chris, but it's a really big time. It's an important time for these young guys, and they can go out there and they can make a difference. I agree with you. I think the fact that Zach Frazier hasn't been wide-eyed because of the experience, or Mason McCormick hasn't been intimidated by the experience. I think that's all good for the Steelers going into the postseason. Those young guys have to continue to play well, and they have to, really be the impetus for this young offensive line going into the postseason.
Agreed. I think this is an opportunity for them to be that. I think that there's a chance for them to grow in this moment. Mike Tomlin, I think, talks about these types of opportunities a lot, and I'm sure we're going to hear that from a little bit from him on his Monday press conference. Because remember, now that this is a Saturday evening game that they're playing the Bengals, everything gets moved up a week. His Tuesday press conference is now on Monday. We'll have a lot more to discuss when we hear from him, so stay tuned for that. But I also want to talk to Ray about one of the most important players on the team, George Pickens, and where he's been, what we saw last week of this first game back, and what we think about George Pickens heading into this stretch and into what will be his contract year next year, all here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Keep it right here. But first, I want to remind you the show is brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can get your new Honda vehicle at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, PA, or visit their website at moonhonda.com. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
It's that time of year again to get the Honda of your dreams during Happy Honda Days, where you'll find great offers on a sporty new Civic, spirited Accord, fun-to-drive HRV, and versatile CRV. So don't wait. Turn your holiday dreams into reality with a new Honda named KBB.com's best value brand. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
We're back here at the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, George Pickens returned last week, and he certainly helped the Steelers offense as far as total production. He had 3 catches for 50 yards, including a 41-yard grab. That was impressive, more along the lines of what he did there. But there were also things to criticize about George Pickens. On the Russell Wilson interception, he didn't run a deeper route, which a lot of people have talked about. That was not the route he was supposed to run. If he runs a deeper route, it holds the safety, and it gives Pat Freiermuth a more open chance for Russell Wilson to hit him. And that could have been a big play for the Steelers instead of a big play for the Chiefs. He also was seen at the end of the game, kind of when the Steelers started making some mistakes in the offense and the game was starting to be over. He was crashing out on the field. He was taking his helmet off, yelling at the sidelines, looking out of control. And he kind of showed the side of George Pickens that people have criticized him for and not being the best teammate in those moments. And showing his frustrations visibly instead of, in trying to working through them on the field. And so I look at that, Ray, and I think another big piece of the puzzle, if they're going to have a turnaround, needs to be George Pickens needs to get back on it as far as being a playmaker for the Steelers and not being a problem for the Steelers. Now, what's funny, again, and it's just so funny, this is a parallel with last year. If you remember, the third game in the losing streak last year was the Colts game when he didn't throw that block for Jaylen Warren, and there was all sorts of heat on George Pickens, and oh man, I don't know if he's going to be the guy. And then they played the Bengals at home. He went off for 2 long touchdowns and got everything straight. And the rest of the year, he was fine. There was no other complaints about George Pickens. He was blocking for Jaylen Warren downfield, blocking for Najee Harris downfield, and it kind of went away. But now you're looking back and you're saying, okay, can George Pickens rally and get back to the kind of football that the Steelers need from him? Ray, what have you seen out of George Pickens? Is this something that he can kind of contain within himself? Because the Steelers need him to be able to keep his head.
Well, they don't have a shot. If he's not engaged, Chris, they don't have a shot in the postseason. It's a terrible reality for the Steelers, but when you look at the way they're constructed, and we just talked about the offensive line, not quite being that unit yet that can carry an offense and pound you into the ground. They need a guy like George Pickens. And, I'll go back to the bye week. We get the Steelers coordinators every week, but we only get to talk to the other assistant coaches once a year, once the season starts. And we got receivers coach Zach Azzani during the bye week. It was around Halloween. And he was just talking about his job and, at that point, everyone was speculating, are you going to go out and make a move? What's going on with George? Because George still had some struggles going on at that point. And he basically said with receivers, it's like opening up a bag of Skittles. You never know what you're going to get, right? I mean, he likened it to, he views his job as being part receivers coach and part psychologist. And I just think this week, especially with everything went on, you mentioned – George crashing out at the end there a couple times. There was one instance, Chris, where Russ had one-on-ones. I think they had verticals. Everyone had a vertical. It was a play they needed to make to keep it interesting. Mm-hmm. And Russ picked out Mike Williams on the other side. George had a one-on-one over here, and Pickens was really demonstrative and kind of throwing a fit because he didn't get the ball in that situation. They got to figure out, number one, they got to figure out ways to get George the ball all the time when he's in one-on-ones. That's got to be an automatic. But also when he's not the guy, when the ball's not going his way, they still have to keep him engaged and let him know it's part of the process too. So really big week for Zach Azzanni, if you ask me. I think he might be the most important guy in that building here this week and before the postseason gets here.
Agreed. I do think that the Steelers, could use Zach Azzanni to be that psychologist that he talked about being, because George Pickens, he's been. That's why George Pickens fell to the second round, right? Like a receiver with his talents, his ability to pluck the ball out of the air, win contested catches, have his kind of speed and everything else he can. They only fall that far if there's either A, injury concerns, which he also had, and B, head concerns, which he's shown here and there with how he's played. But I think the way you put it was perfect. They have to keep him engaged. That is the key, because in that Bengals win that they had last year, back at home that ended their losing streak, what did they do? They got the ball to him early. He got the quick slant, boom, up the middle. All of a sudden, George Pickens is locked in and he's killing the Bengals all week long, and you don't have these problems. And again, I think it's important to point out that even while George Pickens was hurt, he wasn't absent from the team. He was rooting on the players. And in fact, even during the losing streak, when they made a big play, he was one of the first guys to congratulate Russ on the sidelines. He was hyping up the defense. He's been engaged throughout the year. He's also had George Pickens moments throughout the year. But I think that this is a guy who can lock in, and they've gotten to lock in at different times. This needs to be another week where Zach Azzanni and Mike Tomlin, because this is supposed to be one of Mike Tomlin's specialties, is getting this. That guy got 9 years out of Antonio Brown before Antonio Brown was just the most uncontrollable player in maybe the history of the NFL. He's done it so many times in his career. Even if it's not for the long term, even if this is just for, hey, just get us through this game and some playoff games with George Pickens keeping it together, and then maybe they trade him after that. Who knows? I'm not saying they will, but even if it's just for this is an important time for this coaching staff to show its ability to communicate and get through to this guy that he just needs to lock in.
Yeah, it's probably not too early to talk about that, Chris. How George responds from this could play a part in how the Steelers offseason unfolds, to be quite honest with you. George, you mentioned 2025 will be the last year of his rookie contract, and they're going to have to make a decision on that. Likely shortly after this season ends, are they going to make him a priority, or are they going to want to sign him to a long-term deal, or are they going to want to explore trading him and getting some value for him while he still holds value? I'm starting to believe that, just keeping him and not giving him a contract, just knowing the way he is, I don't think that would be it would be hard for him to be on the roster for the entire 2025 season and not have him know what's going to happen after that. I think that, that probably wouldn't be a good thing for the Steelers. So, I think this is a big week for George. I think this is a big couple of weeks if they get on a run. Maybe George can sort of, draw a different route, different path for his Steelers career. But the way it's going right now, he has to right himself, and he has to right himself for the team's sake. How he responds is going to play a big part in how this team responds. And if he responds well, I think they're going to have a puncher's chance. If not, then I'm not too sure this losing streak is going to have an end here this season.
This is where we were talking about at the top of the show, the chance for the bounce back. They need George Pickens to play the way that they know he can play. They need this offensive line to be the physical group they know they can be. They need Russell Wilson to not turn the ball over, make the right reads. They need this defense to not blow coverages. These are all things within their own control. These are all things that they can handle themselves. If the Steelers can do that this week, and they do have the long week, they play it on Wednesday. Granted, this is now not a 10-day break. It's a 9-day break with Saturday. It's still a chance for this team to figure itself out, play its kind of football. Even if it's not perfect football that it plays against the Bengals, play good football, get a win against a hot team, and you can set yourself up for a postseason run if you can get those things together. But it all starts with practicing well this week. We will be at practice all week long, including today, where Mike Tomlin will speak from his press conference at UPMC Rooney Sports Complex. We'll have our guys there covering that on, and then practice all week long. Thanks again for tuning in to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo here today. And as always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all your Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily episodes that come out from all of our different sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We'll be back here Wednesday on the North Shore Drive podcast, but tune in tomorrow with more thoughts from our guys at practice and Chipped Ham and Football from Brian Batko.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.